What if the most shocking moment at an awards ceremony wasn't a speech, a scandal, or a slip-up, but a look that lasted just 3 seconds too long? That's not the kind of moment you expect at an event meant to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a space carved out for peace, for progress, for the power of community. But this year's MLK Jr. Beloved Community Awards did something different, and not in the way anyone expected. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began like most awards shows, carefully orchestrated, elegant, and overwhelmingly symbolic. Celebrities, activists, artists, and diplomats arrived to pay tribute to civil rights legends and highlight new voices committed to justice. But this wasn't the night people would remember for a speech about hope. It was a night defined by tension. Because when Billie Eilish stepped up to that microphone, dressed in solemn black, a single silver pin at her collar, the air in the room shifted. Her tone was calm, her words deliberate, but one sentence, one seemingly offhand comment buried deep in a larger statement, sparked a wave of confusion and slow-burning chaos that's still unraveling. A line that didn't name anyone directly, didn't accuse, didn't shout, but somehow hit hard enough that multiple outlets, within the hour, were running headlines about a public humiliation. And almost all of them were using the same word, wannabe. So what happened? Let's slow this down. Because to understand the moment everyone's talking about, we need to understand the layers behind it. The faces in the audience, the eyes darting across the stage, the quiet calculations happening behind smiles, and why what was said, or what wasn't, might speak to something deeper than a single night. And then, there's Meghan Markle. Was she the target? Was she merely present? Or did the room assume too much? Here's the thing. Nobody at the ceremony interrupted. Nobody objected out loud. Not one person issued an immediate statement to clarify what happened. In fact, the most uncomfortable part might have been how quiet everything was afterward. But that silence, it said plenty. Because while Billie never mentioned Meghan by name, several attendees insist the implication was crystal clear. They claimed there was a pause, a carefully timed pause, before Billie delivered that final beat. That smirk, that subtle glance. And depending on where you were sitting, it either felt like a subtle dig or a direct hit. But we're not here to sensationalize. Not today. This isn't about taking sides or manufacturing drama out of discomfort. This is about unpacking a moment that caught people off guard, that raised questions about authenticity, representation, and who gets to occupy the stage when the conversation is about justice versus when it's about performance. Because this wasn't just a musical artist cracking a joke. It was Billie Eilish, an icon for a generation raised on activism and suspicion, questioning the intent behind another public figure's presence, and whether that line was meant to be dismissive or merely misunderstood. It landed hard. Now, here's where it gets more complicated. In the minutes following Billie's speech, you could feel the discomfort radiating. Camera shots widened. Stage lighting dimmed ever so slightly. And Meghan, according to 2 witnesses seated nearby, shifted in her chair but never once looked toward the podium again. No words. No reaction. Just stillness. Why? Did she feel attacked? Or did she know, before the rest of us, that this was coming? Because here's something most people missed. This wasn't Billie's first reference to performative activism. In interviews over the last year, she's been increasingly vocal about how celebrity engagement with social justice often drifts into performance, aesthetic, and self-branding. And that particular night, with Meghan Markle in attendance, fresh off a series of quietly canceled initiatives and Netflix-backed impact projects that never materialized, it suddenly seemed less like a general statement and more like a pointed critique. But what truly lit the fuse wasn't the line itself. It was what followed. The hesitation in the room. The ripple of stunned expressions. The way some applauded, while others just stared. One audience member, a senior organizer with the Southern Freedom Collective, later told reporters, "That was the kind of remark people feel but don't say." And when she said it, I knew exactly who she meant. Still, others argue it was all misread. That Billie was being abstract. That we're reading too much into the tone, the pause, the smirk. Maybe. But let's not pretend this happened in a vacuum. Because just weeks before this event, Meghan had quietly announced her own new foundation, a rebranding of her previous charity venture that many said felt like a reset, a relaunch, a reboot. And what do reboots need? Reputation, visibility, acceptance. So was her appearance at the awards part of that campaign? And if so, was Billie Eilish calling that out? We don't know. But here's what we do know. Billie's comment didn't land like a joke. It landed like a decision. A decision to draw a line between those who are the community and those who want to be seen in proximity to it. And that distinction? That's the part that stung. Especially because this wasn't the kind of room where reputations are made. It's the kind of room where they get measured. So when Billie used the word wannabe, even if it was buried in a larger sentence, even if it was general, even if she never said Meghan Markle out loud, it set something in motion that hasn't stopped spinning. Media outlets scrambled. Publicists fumbled. One civil rights leader reportedly called for an emergency press call the next morning, trying to downplay the moment without erasing it entirely. But the audience? The people who were actually there? They weren't confused. Not really. And one person, who sat just 2 seats away from Meghan, later whispered to a journalist. She looked like she'd been waiting for that moment all night. Which leads us here. Not to Billie, not to Meghan, but to the question underneath both of them. Who gets to show up in a space built on someone else's legacy and claim it as their own? And if we can't agree on that, then what happened next won't just surprise you. It might change how you see both women entirely. Purpose, set the stage. No conclusions, only atmosphere. Build tension without confirming intent. The room was already humming before the lights even dimmed. It's always like that at events like this, where legacy meets spotlight, where cameras blur into ceremonial robes, and where people wear their causes as deliberately as their clothes. But this year's beloved community awards felt different. Not louder, not flashier, just heavier. And maybe that's the thing no one's really talking about. Because if you rewind to an hour before Billie Eilish took the stage, before the now infamous line, before the headlines, you'll notice the subtle signs that something wasn't sitting right. For starters, the seating chart had been redrawn twice. One event planner, speaking off record, said that several attendees had requested not to be seated near certain figures with recent controversy around charitable transparency. That line alone opens a whole different story, but we're not going there just yet. All you need to know is this. People were shifting in their chairs before any speech had begun. And Meghan? She was there. Front section, stage left. Dressed in a deep navy silk wrap dress, flanked by 2 nonprofit executives from a new media coalition in Atlanta. Smiling, poised, but not exactly blending in. There's a difference between being a guest and being watched. Now, let's talk about the atmosphere. The stage was minimalist, lit in soft lavender. Behind it, projected in looping slow motion, were archival clips of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King. Silent footage, no audio, just the sound of live strings playing below. Elegant, almost sacred, like a visual prayer. And yet, despite the careful staging, there was a strange kind of distance in the air, as if some people were performing presence, while others were waiting to perform something else. You could feel the energy shift each time a new guest walked in. Applause varied, not just in volume, but in sincerity. Some names carried weight, others carried baggage. When Billie Eilish arrived, no one missed it. There wasn't a roar of recognition, but there was a ripple, something between intrigue and confusion. She wasn't on the original docket, at least not publicly. But there she was, simple black suit, minimal makeup, green strands peeking out beneath a loose bun. No entourage. She didn't take selfies, didn't linger, just took her seat and watched the stage, stone still. A journalist seated near her later recalled. She had that look she gets before an interview, where you can't tell if she's bored or furious. Still, no one expected tension. Not from Billie. Not at an event like this. But here's the thing most people ignore about nights like these. Sometimes, the real speeches happen long before a mic is turned on. They happen in glances. In who sits where. In who gets introduced first. In how long the audience claps, and when they don't. And what made this night strange wasn't that it was controversial. It was that no one was sure where the controversy was yet. And still, people were uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that just 3 months ago, Meghan had posted a now-deleted message about reclaiming spaces of impact, a phrase that many critics said felt more self-referential than service-oriented. Maybe it was that 3 of the night's honorees had reportedly expressed concerns about celebrity involvement eclipsing activist voices. Or maybe it was just the wrong mix of people with too much history trying to share the same spotlight. Whatever it was already there. Long before the applause. Long before the spotlight turned. Long before Billie Eilish stepped on stage and said what she said. The energy was already off. Like the room knew something was coming. But didn't know from where. And then, 15 minutes after intermission, the lights dimmed a second time. The strings stopped. And the host simply said, "Our next speaker is Billie Eilish." Purpose: present the moment without resolving it. Focus on how it landed, not what was meant. It wasn't loud. It wasn't biting. There was no tremble in her voice. No stutter. No raised eyebrow to signal something was coming. In fact, if you were only half listening, Billie Eilish's speech at the MLK Jr. Beloved Community Awards might have passed like any other, reverent, carefully worded, heavy with references to activism, art, and generational fatigue. But if you were listening closely, really listening, there was a moment, a shift. Somewhere around the 5-minute mark, Billie paused. Not because she lost her place, not to breathe, but in that way performers do when they want the silence to say something. She looked up, scanned the audience, and then she said this. It's not enough to show up in the room wearing the right colors, quoting the right names, and hoping legacy rubs off on you. You're either part of the work, or you're a wannabe who wants the photo. 12 words. That's all it took. And the room? It didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It didn't even freeze. It shifted, almost like it exhaled without meaning to. Because let's be clear, Billie didn't say anyone's name. She didn't gesture, didn't glance in a specific direction. But somehow, instantly, people assumed who she meant. Or maybe they didn't assume. Maybe they already knew. A journalist live tweeting from the press table stopped mid-sentence. A longtime civil rights attorney in the third row leaned forward, then back again, as if he'd missed something, or couldn't believe he hadn't. And Meghan? She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just reached once for her water glass, held it, and didn't sip. That, more than anything, is what stuck with people. Not the line itself, but the quiet after. Because the thing about silence is it tells you where people are sitting internally. And in that silence, lines were being drawn. Some applauded after a beat, hesitantly, scattered, like they were testing the air first. Others didn't move, didn't clap, just stared at Billie like they'd just heard something that hadn't been written down beforehand. Which, to be fair, maybe they had. An event volunteer backstage later told a local reporter that Billie's speech notes were printed, then scrapped an hour before she spoke. No explanation. Just gone. She rewrote everything by hand, they said. Kept it in her jacket pocket until showtime. So was that line improvised? Or had it been simmering for weeks? Because here's the detail people keep circling back to. The word wannabe. It's not a term you hear at legacy events like this one. It's loaded. It's juvenile. It cuts in a way performative doesn't. It implies desperation, imitation, a reaching that isn't welcome. And when delivered by someone like Billie, whose own fame was built on pushing back against industry mimicry, it becomes a scalpel. Was it fair? Was it intentional? Did it belong there? We don't know. Billie didn't elaborate. She didn't clarify. She finished her speech, thanked the organizers, stepped away from the podium, and disappeared backstage. No follow-up. No post-speech mingling. No social media post recapping her remarks. She was gone. And in that vacuum, the meaning filled itself. Media outlets latched onto it within the hour. Billie Eilish calls out celebrity activism. Singer blasts wannabes in the movement. Was that a subtle dig at Meghan Markle? But those headlines missed something. Because what shook people wasn't the possibility that Billie meant Meghan. It was the possibility that everyone in the room agreed. And yet, no one said a word. Not publicly. Not that night. But something cracked. And what came next didn't just deepen the moment. It exposed something the cameras weren't supposed to catch. There's a strange kind of silence that only happens in rooms where everyone knows what's just occurred, but no one wants to admit it. That's what lingered after Billie Eilish walked off the stage. Not applause. Not chatter. Not even whispered speculation. Just a strange, tense stillness. You might have missed it watching the broadcast. Cameras cut away almost instantly. The wide shot returned to the stage backdrop, and the host's voice, measured, a bit too cheerful, filled the space with the next segment. Something about youth scholarships. Something safe. But those few seconds in the room, uncut, uninterrupted, told a different story. A woman in the fourth row looked directly at Meghan, then looked away. A man seated on the aisle tapped twice on his phone and didn't look up again. And Meghan herself? She was motionless. Not frozen. Not stunned. Just still. Like she'd rehearsed the art of non-response so thoroughly, it had become instinct. But even the best rehearsals can't conceal everything. According to a witness seated 2 rows behind her, Meghan's knuckles were pressed tightly against her lap. Her fingers curled inward, a micro-clench that lasted nearly half a minute. Not dramatic. Not even noticeable to the cameras. But in a room like that, where posture is a form of messaging, that said something. And then came the glance. One of the award recipients, a grassroots organizer from Oakland, took the stage next. As he reached the podium, he looked across the crowd, and briefly, unmistakably, his eyes landed on Meghan. Not in judgment, not even in sympathy, more like recognition. Like he knew exactly what had just happened.